The fog pressed against the carriage windows like something living, turning the gas lamps of Berkeley Square into smudged stars of amber light. Inside the velvet-lined compartment, Olivia Hooper sat with her spine rigid against the tufted seat, watching the grand houses of Mayfair emerge and disappear through the mist like ships navigating treacherous waters. She was 22 years old, and her position in the family had been established long before she was old enough to question it. The hierarchy had been constructed methodically, relentlessly, through 100 daily reminders dressed as sisterly advice. A remark about how pale blue drained her complexion, though the shade brought out the clarity of her eyes. An observation about her unfortunate tendency towards silence, though she spoke more sense in 5 words than Madison managed in 50. The foundation of her invisibility had been laid stone by stone, and the master mason sat across from her now, adjusting her emerald gloves with practiced satisfaction. "Really, Olivia," Madison's voice sliced through the rhythmic clatter of wheels on cobblestones, sharp as a blade wrapped in silk. "You cannot possibly believe that gown will serve you tonight." Madison Hooper filled the carriage the way sunlight filled a room, aggressively, allowing no corner to remain untouched. At 19, she possessed the particular kind of beauty that London society had been trained to worship. Copper hair arranged in an elaborate crown of curls, each ringlet positioned to suggest effortless perfection that had taken 3 hours to achieve. She had been proclaimed the diamond of the season before the season had even begun, a coronation that their mother had orchestrated with the precision of a military campaign. Madison had everything the ton valued, and she wore her advantages like armor. But beneath the emerald velvet and the practiced smiles lived a hunger that no amount of attention could satisfy. She needed to be the sun, which meant Olivia must remain the shadow. "The gown is appropriate for a country cousin," Olivia said quietly, her fingers tracing the simple embroidery at her cuff. The dress in question was pale blue silk, beautiful in its restraint, but deliberately modest. It was exactly the sort of gown her mother insisted she wear, respectable enough to avoid reproach, plain enough to avoid competition with Madison's calculated splendor. "Appropriate, yes, but why must you attend at all?" Madison's smile was a masterpiece of false concern as she leaned forward, the plumes in her hair trembling with the motion. "You know how exhausting you find these events, how the crowds overwhelm you, how terribly anxious you become." The words were shaped like sympathy, but Olivia recognized the architecture of her cage. Every phrase Madison spoke was another bar, another lock, another reminder that the Hooper family operated on a strict economy. There was room for only one daughter to shine, and that daughter had been chosen before Olivia learned to walk.
"I find them manageable," Olivia replied, keeping her gaze on the passing scenery rather than meeting her sister's eyes. She had learned this defense long ago. That direct confrontation only fed Madison's need for drama, while quiet persistence sometimes allowed her small victories. "Manageable," Madison tested the word as though it were a wine of questionable vintage. "How perfectly adequate. Mother says the Duke of Arundel himself will be in attendance tonight." She adjusted her bodice, ensuring the décolletage was positioned for maximum effect. "They say he's impossibly discerning, that he sees through every performance, every calculation. Imagine being able to capture the attention of a man like that." The carriage lurched over uneven stones, and Olivia's hand shot out to steady herself against the window frame. In the foggy glass, she caught a glimpse of her own reflection, a woman in muted blue, hair dressed simply, face composed into an expression of careful neutrality. But in that fleeting moment, in the distorted mirror of condensation and lamplight, she saw something else, a flicker of determination her sister had consistently failed to notice. Behind them, in the following carriage, their mother would be reviewing final instructions with their younger brother. Ahead, through the thickening fog, Arundel House rose like a fortress of golden windows and iron gates. Inside waited London's most eligible duke, a man whose fortune was matched only by his reputation for seeing exactly what others tried to hide. Madison smoothed her gloves one final time, her smile sharp with confidence. "Do try to stay out of the way tonight, darling. You know how you have a tendency to linger where you're not wanted. It would be such a shame if your presence complicated things for those of us who actually belong." The carriage wheels ground to a halt. A footman in ducal livery appeared at the door, his face carefully blank as he handed first Madison, then Olivia, down onto the rain-slicked stones. The grand entrance to Arundel House blazed before them, music and laughter spilling from the open doors like an invitation to a world Olivia had been taught she could observe but never truly enter. Madison ascended the steps as though she were already a duchess, her emerald gown catching the light with each calculated movement. She did not look back to see if her sister followed. She never did. But Olivia climbed those steps anyway, her pulse steady beneath the pale blue silk, her mind already noting the details that others overlooked, the architectural precision of the entrance, the strategic positioning of the receiving line, the way the Duke's staff moved with the efficiency of a well-maintained machine. She had spent her life being told she was the lesser daughter, the backup plan, the permanent second. Tonight, she thought, as she crossed the threshold into the blazing warmth of the ballroom, someone would finally prove that assessment wrong. She just didn't know yet that someone would be herself. The morning Madison decided to conquer London began, as most of her campaigns did, with Olivia's labour. "The lace is puckering at the shoulder." Madison stood before the full-length mirror in her chamber, turning to examine the emerald gown from every angle. Sunlight poured through the windows of the Hooper townhouse, catching the beadwork on her bodice and transforming her into something between a woman and a jewel. "You'll need to take it apart and reset the entire panel. I cannot possibly be seen within theory and needlework." Olivia knelt on the floor beside her sister's reflection, pins between her lips, her fingers already working to release the offending seam. Around them, Madison's chamber resembled the aftermath of a particularly indulgent siege, gowns draped over every surface, ribbons cascading from drawers, 3 different pairs of dancing slippers abandoned near the hearth. The room smelled of rosewater and ambition. "The lace is French," Olivia said quietly, removing the pins from her mouth. "It was expensive. Then it should lay properly." Madison examined her profile, adjusting the curl that framed her left cheekbone. "Mother says the Duchess of Pemberton will be wearing Parisian silk tonight. I refuse to be outshone by a woman who's been married for 15 years and still hasn't produced an heir." Olivia's fingers moved with practiced efficiency, undoing hours of work without comment. She had learned long ago that Madison's pronouncements were not invitations to conversation, but rather royal decrees issued from the throne of her own certainty. The emerald gown would be perfect because Olivia would make it perfect. The copper curls would gleam because Olivia had sourced the particular rinse water Madison preferred. The season would be a triumph because Olivia had managed every detail that existed beneath that triumph. "You have a speck of thread on your shoulder," Madison observed, her gaze flickering to Olivia's reflection. "It's terribly unbecoming. You really should take more care with your appearance." Olivia glanced down at her morning dress, a simple grey wool that had been mended twice at the hem. The thread in question was from Madison's gown, transferred during the work, but pointing this out would accomplish nothing except to invite a lecture on personal responsibility and the importance of maintaining proper standards. Through the open door, the sounds of the household filtered upward, the cook arguing with the butcher's delivery boy about the quality of the lamb, the upstairs maid humming as she changed the linens, their mother's voice drifting from the morning room where she held court over correspondence and social strategy.
It was a Tuesday, which meant Olivia had already balanced the household accounts, approved the week's menus, and written 3 letters on her mother's behalf to various society matrons whose favor needed cultivation. "I've been thinking," Madison announced, which always preceded a statement that would require additional work from someone other than herself, "that I should host a small gathering before the Ashworth Ball, something intimate, perhaps 20 guests, nothing elaborate, just enough to ensure that everyone understands I'm not simply attending the season, I'm defining it." Olivia's hands stilled on the lace. A gathering for 20 would require coordinating with cook, hiring additional staff, acquiring flowers that were out of season, and somehow accomplishing all of this within the week while maintaining their mother's already demanding social calendar. It would also require funds that Olivia knew, from her intimate knowledge of the household ledgers, they did not possess without sacrificing other necessities. "Mother hasn't mentioned additional entertainments," Olivia said carefully. "Then I'll mention it to her." Madison's smile was radiant with the confidence of someone who had never been denied. "The Duke of Arundel is returning to London after 2 years abroad. Every eligible woman in England will be positioning herself to catch his attention. I intend to have already caught it before the competition even realizes the game has begun." The Duke of Arundel. Olivia had heard the name whispered through drawing rooms with the kind of reverence usually reserved for military heroes or particularly lucrative investment opportunities. He was young for a duke, wealthy beyond measure, and reportedly possessed a mind sharp enough to slice through the practiced performances that characterized most society interactions. He had left London rather abruptly after his father's death, managing his estates personally rather than delegating to stewards, and his return had been anticipated with the fervor of a second coming. "I'm sure you'll make a memorable impression," Olivia said, which was true. Madison always made an impression. Whether that impression was the one she intended was a separate question entirely. Memorable. Madison tested the word, found it satisfactory, and returned her attention to her reflection. "Yes, that's exactly what I'll be. Every other woman will simply fade into the wallpaper, as they should. Including you, I suppose, though that's hardly a change from your usual state." The words were delivered with such casual certainty that they might have been observations about the weather. Olivia's hands returned to the lace, her expression unchanged. She had become an expert at absorbing these small cuts, at allowing them to pass through her without leaving visible wounds. It was a survival skill she had cultivated since childhood, when she first understood that the Hooper family operated on a strict hierarchy, with precisely one position available at the top. "There," Olivia said, smoothing the repaired seam. "The lace sits properly now." Madison barely glanced at the correction. She was already moving to her dressing table, selecting from an array of jeweled combs that Olivia had organized by color the previous week. The emerald and the ash, existing in the same space but inhabiting entirely different worlds, one catching the light, demanding attention, secure in her position as the family's singular masterpiece, the other ensuring that the light had something to catch, invisible in her competence, necessary in her erasure. Outside, London continued its daily business, unaware that within one modest townhouse, 2 sisters prepared for a season that would crack open the carefully constructed order of their lives. Madison would enter ballrooms as the diamond everyone expected, and Olivia would follow behind, carrying the weight of everything that made that entrance possible, believing herself to be exactly what her sister claimed, wallpaper against which more vivid lives were lived. She did not yet know that some observers preferred subtlety to spectacle, that some men valued the architect over the architecture, that being underestimated was sometimes the greatest advantage of all. The ballroom at Arundel House blazed with enough candles to illuminate a small city, their flames reflected endlessly in the gilt mirrors that lined the walls. Olivia stood at the threshold, momentarily blinded by the transition from fog-choked darkness to this manufactured daylight.
and felt the familiar tightening in her chest that accompanied large gatherings. Not anxiety, precisely, but rather a heightened awareness of her own visibility, her own inadequacy in spaces designed for those who thrived under observation. Madison had already vanished into the crush of silk and jewels, drawn toward the center of the room, where the most important guests congregated like planets orbiting a particularly brilliant sun. Their mother had swept off to join a cluster of matrons whose strategic positioning suggested they were already cataloging potential matches and assessing competition. Olivia had been left at the entrance with the vague instruction to make herself available should anyone require assistance, which was family code for remain visible enough to avoid scandal, but invisible enough to avoid comparison. She moved along the perimeter of the ballroom, keeping to the shadows between the columns, her pale blue gown rendering her nearly invisible against the cream-colored walls. Around her, London's elite performed their elaborate social ballet, young ladies laughing behind fans, gentlemen striking poses of calculated nonchalance, chaperones maintaining watchful positions like generals surveying a battlefield. Everyone positioned precisely where they needed to be, playing precisely the role they'd been assigned. Through an archway to her left, Olivia caught a glimpse of refuge, a corridor, dimly lit and mercifully empty, stretched toward what appeared to be the back regions of the house. Where there were back corridors in grand houses, there were usually libraries, rooms designed for contemplation rather than performance, spaces where a woman might sit unnoticed until the evening's obligations had been sufficiently fulfilled. Olivia closed the door behind her and released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly as she moved toward the bookshelves, running her fingers along the spines. Poetry, philosophy, works of natural science, several volumes on agricultural management. The collection suggested a mind that valued knowledge over ornamentation, substance over show. Not what she would have expected from a household currently hosting London's most elaborate social performance. She selected a volume at random, something about improvements in crop rotation, and settled into one of the chairs by the fire. It wasn't that she disliked social gatherings precisely, it was simply that they required a particular kind of performance she had never mastered and had long since stopped attempting. Madison could command a room through sheer force of presence. Olivia preferred to observe from the margins, noting the small dramas and strategic maneuverings that others missed while they were busy being dazzling. The book fell open to a page filled with detailed diagrams of field patterns. She traced the lines with her finger, finding unexpected comfort in the logical precision of it all. Plants arranged according to rational principles, each serving a purpose in maintaining soil quality. No hierarchy based on beauty or charm, simply function and mutual benefit. Perhaps she should have been born a farmer's daughter instead of a gentleman's. At least then her competence would have been valued over her appearance. Most guests prefer the ballroom to the agricultural texts. The voice came from the doorway, low and tinged with amusement. Olivia's head snapped up, the book nearly tumbling from her lap. A man stood at the threshold, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in evening black that suggested both wealth and a certain contempt for excessive ornamentation. His hair was dark, swept back from a face that might have been handsome if not for the severity of its lines. But it was his eyes that held her attention, grey as winter fog and sharp enough to dissect whatever they observed. "I apologize," Olivia said, rising quickly and nearly dropping the book in the process. "I didn't realize the room was occupied. I'll return to—" "The room wasn't occupied. I arrived after you did." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a soft click that seemed terribly final. "I'm escaping the same gathering you are, which makes us fellow refugees rather than host and trespasser." Olivia's mind raced through possibilities. He'd said the same gathering, not my ball, which suggested he might not be the Duke after all, but rather another guest seeking sanctuary. Though the casual authority with which he moved through what was clearly his own home suggested otherwise, and there was something in the way he looked at her,
not with the dismissive glance she was accustomed to, but with actual attention, as though she were a puzzle worth solving rather than wallpaper to be ignored. "I find agricultural texts fascinating," she said, which was both true and utterly ridiculous given the circumstances. "Do you?" It wasn't quite a question. He moved closer, his gaze dropping to the book she still clutched. "That particular volume is quite technical. Most people find it impenetrably dull. Most people haven't had to manage a household budget that includes provisions for an estate staff, tenant welfare, and maintaining appearances in town while the funds stretch thinner each season." The words escaped before she could stop them, honest in a way she'd learned long ago was dangerous around strangers. Something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps, or recognition. "You manage your family's accounts." Someone must. Olivia closed the book carefully, vying herself time to regain control of the conversation. "And I find that understanding the principles of estate management helps when one is trying to extract value from limited resources." How remarkably practical. He was closer now, close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, suggesting either frequent thought or frequent amusement. And how remarkably unusual for a young woman at a ball to admit to such things. Most prefer to discuss the weather or compliment the refreshments. "I'm not most young women." The statement hung between them, more revealing than she had intended. She was suddenly acutely aware that she was alone in a room with a strange man, that propriety demanded she excuse herself immediately, that remaining here would be commented upon if discovered. But something in his expression, that sharp attention that suggested he saw her rather than simply looked past her, kept her rooted in place. "No," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving her face. "I don't believe you are." The silence that followed his words stretched like silk pulled taut, fragile and charged with possibility. Olivia knew she should excuse herself, retreat to the ballroom where propriety and her assigned role waited to reclaim her. Instead, she found herself meeting his gaze with a directness that would have horrified her mother. "You have me at a disadvantage," she said. "You know I'm hiding from your ball, reading your books, and managing my family's finances. I know nothing about you except that you also find your own gathering tedious enough to escape." The corner of his mouth lifted, not quite a smile, but something close to appreciation. "Elliot Hunter, Duke of Arundel, though I've spent the last 2 years trying to forget the title while managing the estates my father left in comprehensive disarray." He moved to the opposite chair, settling into it with the ease of someone who had spent many evenings in this exact spot. "And you are—" "Olivia Hooper." She watched his face for recognition of the name, for the slight adjustment in expression that would indicate he'd heard Madison's campaign of self-promotion, but his features remained neutral, attentive. "My sister is Madison Hooper, the one in the emerald gown who was positioned strategically near the entrance to ensure everyone would notice her arrival." "Ah!" Something flickered across his face, understanding, perhaps, or confirmation of a suspicion. "The diamond of the season. Your mother has been remarkably thorough in ensuring London knows of her existence." "My mother is nothing if not thorough." Olivia set the agriculture book on the small table between them. "Madison's success has been planned with military precision since she was old enough to understand what beauty could purchase." "And you?" Elliot leaned forward slightly, his attention sharpening. "What was planned for you?" The question was dangerous, inviting honesty that could be wielded as a weapon, but there was something in his expression, genuine curiosity rather than cruel amusement, that made her consider answering truthfully. "I was planned to be useful, to manage the household so Mother could focus on Madison's presentation, to ensure the books balanced so there would be funds for gowns and entertainments, to be present at events but not prominent, visible but not memorable." Elliot was quiet for a moment, his grey eyes studying her with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable but somehow wasn't. "That seems a tremendous waste of a capable mind." "Capable minds are less valuable than beautiful faces in the marriage market." The bitterness in her voice surprised her. She'd spent years carefully moderating her tone, ensuring she never sounded resentful or envious, But something about this room, this man, this strange pocket of honesty carved from an evening of performance made careful moderation seem suddenly exhausting. In the marriage market, perhaps, but I've recently discovered that beautiful faces are remarkably common in London ballrooms, while minds capable of managing complex household economies are apparently quite rare. He returned to his chair, opening the book to a marked page. I've been attempting to implement new drainage systems across my Yorkshire estates. The principle is sound, but the execution requires balancing tenant concerns, seasonal planting cycles, and infrastructure costs that compound across multiple properties. My steward insists it cannot be done without either bankrupting the estate or displacing half the tenant farmers.
Olivia found herself leaning forward, her interest captured despite herself. Have you considered a phased implementation? Address the most critical drainage issues first, coordinate with the natural crop rotation so you're not disrupting active fields, and use the improved yields from the corrected properties to fund subsequent phases. The improved yields wouldn't materialize for at least 2 seasons. Then you finance the initial phase through temporary reduction in other expenses. Not the estate maintenance or tenant welfare, those are investments that compound over time. But there are always expenditures that serve appearance rather than function. Elliot's expression shifted into something that might have been delight. Are you suggesting I'm a hypocrite for hosting this ball? I'm suggesting that even dukes must make strategic decisions about resource allocation. Olivia felt heat rise to her cheeks, suddenly aware she was lecturing one of England's wealthiest men on financial management. Though I apologize, it's hardly my place to— It's absolutely your place if you're the only person in this entire gathering who said anything worth hearing. He set the book aside. Tell me, Miss Hooper, what else would you do differently if you were managing the Arundel estates? The question hung between them, part challenge and part invitation. In the ballroom, Madison would be deploying her carefully practiced charm, ensuring every influential matron and eligible gentleman knew her name. Their mother would be cultivating connections, building the social architecture that would elevate Madison to Duchess. And here sat Olivia, in a library with the very duke they'd come to ensnare, discussing drainage systems and budget allocation instead of poetry and romance. She should deflect, should offer some modest disclaimer about her limited knowledge, should transform herself back into the quiet, unassuming sister who never offered opinions that might overshadow Madison's performance. Instead, she began outlining a strategy for tenant housing improvements coordinated with diversified income streams. Elliot listened with focused attention, occasionally interjecting questions that proved he wasn't simply being polite, but genuinely engaged. The conversation shifted from estate management to agricultural innovation, their voices low and earnest in the firelit quiet. Time moved differently in that library. Minutes accumulated unnoticed, the evening deepening around them while they debated the merits of crop rotation versus soil amendments, the balance between tenant welfare and estate profitability, the fundamental challenge of implementing change in systems designed to resist it. Neither noticed the ballroom growing quieter as guests began departing. Neither saw the shadow that passed briefly in the corridor outside. Madison, searching for her sister, her expression shifting from irritation to something colder when she glimpsed Olivia through the partially open door, sitting beside London's most eligible duke, their heads bent together in conversation that looked nothing like the flirtation she'd planned to deploy. In the library, Olivia laughed at something Elliot said, and the sound was genuine in a way her laughter hadn't been in years. Elliot watched her face illuminate with amusement and thought that perhaps beauty wasn't quite as common as he'd claimed. It was simply that most people looked for it in all the wrong places. The carriage ride home occurred in a silence so taut it might have been strung between them like wire. Madison sat across from Olivia, her emerald gown still perfect despite the evening's exertions, her copper curls still artfully arranged. But something in her expression had shifted, hardened, like cream left too long in the sun.
Their mother, seated beside Madison, chattered with obvious satisfaction about the evening's triumphs. Lady Pemberton had complimented Madison's gown. Lord Ashworth had specifically requested an introduction. 3 separate matrons had remarked on Madison's resemblance to a portrait by Reynolds, which was precisely the sort of elevated comparison Mrs. Hooper had been cultivating. And the Duke himself was in attendance, Mrs. Hooper continued, smoothing her gloves with quick, nervous movements. Though I confess I barely glimpsed him. He seemed rather elusive throughout the evening. Madison, darling, did you manage an introduction? No. The word emerged clipped, sharp as broken glass. Madison's gaze remained fixed on Olivia with an intensity that made the small space feel suffocating. The Duke was otherwise occupied, quite thoroughly occupied, in fact. Olivia kept her expression neutral, her hands folded in her lap, though her pulse had begun a nervous acceleration. She'd slipped back into the ballroom nearly an hour after she'd departed, hoping her absence had gone unnoticed, but clearly it had not. How unfortunate, Mrs. Hooper said, though her tone suggested it was merely a temporary setback rather than a true disappointment. There will be other opportunities, of course. The season has only just begun. Yes, Madison's smile was a masterpiece of calculation, beautiful and utterly false. Other opportunities, though one does wonder what could have kept the Duke so thoroughly engaged that he missed the very guests he'd invited to his own ball. Don't you wonder, Olivia? The question landed like a blade, precise and deliberately placed. Olivia met her sister's gaze and saw something she'd never quite seen before, not simple jealousy or competitive irritation, but actual hatred, cold and comprehensive. I'm sure I couldn't say, Olivia replied quietly. Perhaps he found the crowd overwhelming. Some people prefer solitude to performance. How perceptive. Madison's tone suggested the opposite. And speaking of solitude, you seemed rather absent yourself for much of the evening. Wherever did you disappear to? Mrs. Hooper's attention sharpened, her social instincts detecting the shift in atmosphere. Olivia, you didn't retire early, did you? We discussed the importance of maintaining visibility. I felt momentarily overwhelmed by the heat, Olivia said, which was not precisely a lie. The ballroom had been stifling before she'd found sanctuary in the library. I stepped into a quieter room to collect myself. It was nothing of consequence. Nothing of consequence, Madison repeated, tasting each word as though testing for poison. How perfectly modest of you. Though I confess, when I went searching for you, concerned naturally about your well-being, I happened to notice you weren't alone in your quiet refuge. You were engaged in what appeared to be quite an animated conversation with a gentleman, in a closed room, unchaperoned. The silence that followed was absolute. Mrs. Hooper's face cycled through shock, horror, and calculation in rapid succession. Even the carriage wheels seemed to quiet, as though the entire world had paused to witness this moment of exposure. That's not, Olivia began, but Madison interrupted with the smooth efficiency of someone who had been rehearsing this speech since the moment she'd glimpsed her sister through the library door. I'm not suggesting anything improper occurred, of course. I'm sure Olivia was simply lost, and the gentleman was kind enough to assist her in finding her way back. Though one does worry about appearances, about how it might look if word spread that the quiet Hooper sister was discovered in a private library with London's most eligible duke engaged in conversation so engrossing they didn't notice an hour passing. The words were shaped like concern, dressed in sisterly worry, but Olivia recognized the architecture of the trap. Madison had transformed a moment of genuine connection into something sordid, calculating, deliberately engineered. She'd made it seem as though Olivia had schemed her way into that library, had manufactured the encounter as a desperate attempt to capture the attention meant for her more deserving sister. An hour? The voice had gone dangerously quiet. Olivia, is this true? We were discussing estate management, Olivia said, hearing how absurd it sounded even as the words left her mouth. Agricultural improvements and tenant welfare. It was entirely proper. Estate management. Madison's laugh was crystalline, musical, devastating. How remarkably convenient that the Duke's interests apparently align so perfectly with your peculiar preoccupations. One might almost think you'd researched his concerns specifically to manufacture common ground. That's not what happened. Of course not. Madison leaned forward, her expression arranging itself into sympathetic understanding that fueled no one. You simply happened to be in his library, reading his books, prepared to discuss precisely the topics that would interest him most. Pure coincidence. I'm certain Mother believes that, just as I'm certain London society will find it perfectly believable when word inevitably spreads. The threat was unsubtle but effective. Mrs. Hooper's face had gone pale, her mind clearly calculating the social damage of having one daughter labeled a schemer while trying to position the other as the season's triumph. The mathematics of reputation were complex, but one truth remained constant. Scandal attached to one sister would inevitably stain them both. "Nothing happened," Olivia said again, but her voice had lost its conviction. Because something had happened, something that mattered more than Madison's reductive interpretation could capture. She'd been seen, actually seen, not as the useful sister or the quiet backdrop, but as a person with thoughts worth hearing, ideas worth engaging. For an hour, she'd existed outside the hierarchy that had defined her entire life. And Madison, who possessed every advantage London society valued, couldn't tolerate even that small rebellion. "I'm sure nothing did," Mrs. Hooper said finally, her tone suggesting the matter was closed, not because it was resolved, but because further discussion would be unproductive. "But, Olivia, you will exercise greater discretion going forward. We cannot afford even the appearance of impropriety, not when Madison's success depends on the family's collective reputation remaining unblemished." The carriage pulled to a stop before their townhouse. Madison descended first, her movements graceful as always, her smile already restored to its practiced perfection. But as she passed Olivia on the narrow steps, she leaned close enough that only her sister could hear. "You'll never be more than second," the words soft as silk and sharp as steel. "No matter what little fantasies that hour in the library inspired, the Duke will realize his mistake soon enough, and when he does, you'll return to exactly where you belong, in my shadow, managing my life, ensuring my triumph, as you are always meant to." Then she swept inside, leaving Olivia standing in the fog-choked street, her sister's words echoing in the space where genuine laughter and intellectual engagement had lived so briefly, so impossibly, just hours before.
The Ashworth ball arrived 3 nights later with all the ceremony of a coronation. Lady Ashworth's annual gathering was considered the true opening of the season, the event where alliances were forged and reputations were either established or destroyed. The ballroom glittered with enough candles and jewels to bankrupt a small nation, and the guest list read like a directory of everyone who mattered in London society. Madison had prepared for this evening the way generals prepared for decisive battles. Her gown was shell-pink silk that had cost more than the Hooper household staff earned in 6 months. Her hair arranged in an elaborate cascade of curls interwoven with seed pearls. She stood near the center of the ballroom, surrounded by a careful constellation of admirers, her laughter carrying across the room like music designed to enchant. Olivia had been positioned near the refreshment tables, dressed in dove gray that rendered her nearly invisible against the damask wallpaper. It was a strategic placement, close enough to the action to fulfill propriety's demands, far enough from Madison to ensure no unfavorable comparisons. Their mother had been explicit in her instructions. Olivia was to remain visible but silent, present but passive, a testament to the family's respectability without drawing attention that belonged solely to her sister. The first waltz was about to begin. Tradition dictated that the most sought-after gentleman would claim the most celebrated lady, a public declaration of interest that society would dissect for weeks.
Every eye in the ballroom tracked the Duke of Arundel as he made his way through the crowd, his expression carefully neutral, his movements unhurried. Madison had positioned herself perfectly, her fan deployed at precisely the right angle, her smile radiant with confident expectation. Olivia watched from her assigned corner, her heart performing gymnastics she didn't fully understand. She hadn't seen Elliot since that evening in his library, hadn't received any correspondence or acknowledgement that their conversation had meant anything beyond a pleasant diversion for a bored host. Madison's words in the carriage had taken root in the space where hope had briefly flourished. You'll never be more than second. A fantasy, his mistake. The Duke was moving toward Madison now, or so it appeared. The crowd parted to allow his passage, matrons whispering behind fans, debutantes adjusting their postures in case his attention might shift. Madison's smile intensified, her body angling toward him with practiced grace, ready to accept what was rightfully hers. But Elliot's gaze never settled on Madison. His gray eyes swept across the ballroom with systematic precision until they found Olivia, half hidden behind a marble column, clutching a glass of lemonade like a talisman against social disaster. And then he changed direction. The shift was subtle enough that most guests didn't immediately register it, but Olivia saw the moment Madison's smile froze, the instant her mother's face went pale with confusion, the second the surrounding matrons realized something unprecedented was occurring. Elliot stopped directly in front of Olivia, tall and imposing in his evening black, and executed a bow that suggested respect rather than condescension. "Miss Hooper, I believe the first waltz is about to begin." The words fell into the space around them like stones into still water, ripples of shock expanding outward. First waltz, the slot reserved for the diamond, the opening statement of the season's most important courtship, and he was asking the wrong sister. Olivia's throat had gone completely dry. "Your Grace, surely there are other ladies who would be more appropriate." "You wasn't asking other ladies." His voice was low enough that only she could hear, but his eyes held something that looked remarkably like determination. "I was asking you, unless you find agricultural discussions insufficient foundation for a waltz." Around them the ballroom had gone preternaturally quiet. Olivia could feel every gaze burning into her, feel the weight of expectation and scandal pressing down like a physical force. Across the room, Madison's face had arranged itself into an expression of shocked sympathy, as though watching her sister commit social suicide through delusion. "People will talk," Olivia whispered. "People always talk." Elliot extended his hand, palm up, an invitation and a challenge. "The question is whether you'll let their talking determine your choices." It was the same question he'd posed in his library, though phrased differently. Whether she would remain in the role assigned to her, useful, invisible, perpetually second, or whether she might claim something for herself, even knowing the cost. Olivia set down her lemonade glass with a hand that trembled only slightly. She placed her fingers in his palm, felt his hand close around hers with gentle certainty, and allowed him to lead her toward the center of the ballroom. The orchestra began. The opening strains of the waltz filled the air, sweet and inevitable. Elliot's hand settled at her waist, proper but unmistakable, and they began to move.
Olivia had learned to waltz the same way she'd learned everything else, through observation and necessity, competent but unremarkable. But Elliot danced with the easy confidence of someone who'd been trained since childhood, and his lead was clear enough that she found herself following without thought, her body responding to subtle pressures and shifts in balance. "You're causing a scandal," she said quietly, acutely aware of the hundreds of eyes tracking their every movement. "I'm dancing with the most interesting woman in the room." Elliot's expression remained neutral, but something in his voice suggested amusement. If that's scandalous, London's standards are even more absurd than I thought. I'm not. Olivia struggled to find words that wouldn't sound like false modesty or fishing for compliments. My sister is the diamond. Everyone knows that. Everyone expects performance over substance, beauty over intelligence, the appearance of perfection over actual competence. They turned, and for a moment Olivia caught sight of Madison's face in the crowd, her expression a mask of barely contained fury. I spent 2 years in Yorkshire discovering that what looks impressive is often hollow, while what appears ordinary frequently conceals extraordinary value. I'd rather dance with someone who understands drainage systems than someone who's mastered the art of strategic hair arrangement. Despite everything, the staring crowd, her sister's rage, her mother's likely hysteria, the social catastrophe unfolding with every step, Olivia felt laughter building in her chest. That may be the least romantic thing anyone has ever said while waltzing. Would you prefer I compose poetry about your eyes? I could, but it would be less honest than admitting I've been thinking about your phased implementation strategy for 3 days. The waltz carried them through the center of the ballroom, past clusters of whispering matrons and shocked debutantes, past Madison, who stood frozen in her shell-pink perfection, past Mrs. Hooper, whose face had cycled through every emotion known to anxious mothers. The music swelled and fell, and Olivia realized with startling clarity that this moment, this impossible, scandalous, utterly improper moment, was the first time in her life she'd been chosen for herself, rather than for her utility. When the final notes faded and Elliot released her, the ballroom erupted into a buzz of conversation that sounded like a hive of particularly agitated bees. He bowed again, formal and deliberate, then looked at her with those sharp grey eyes that saw past performance to truth. "Thank you, Miss Hooper," he said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "That was considerably more enjoyable than most social obligations." Then, quieter, meant only for her, "Don't let them make you small again." He departed to fulfill other social requirements, leaving Olivia standing in the center of the ballroom, her grey gown suddenly feeling less like camouflage and more like a declaration. Around her, London society began the work of processing what they'd witnessed, of fitting this unexpected development into their carefully maintained hierarchies. And across the room, Madison smiled her beautiful, terrible smile and began planning her next move. The invitation arrived 2 days after the Ashworth ball, delivered by a footman in ducal livery who waited with professional patience while Mrs. Hooper broke the seal with trembling fingers. Olivia watched from the doorway of the morning-room, her embroidery forgotten in her lap, as her mother's face cycled through confusion, shock, and something that might have been calculation. "It's from the Duke," Mrs. Hooper said, her voice carefully neutral. "He's hosting an intimate dinner, Thursday next, for 12 guests." She paused, her eyes scanning the elegant script. "He's requested Miss Olivia Hooper's presence specifically." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the servants seemed to pause in their movements, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Madison, who had been arranging roses in a vase with studied disinterest, went perfectly still. "Olivia," Madison's voice was light, curious, utterly poisonous. "Surely that's a mistake. Perhaps the Duke's secretary misunderstood his instructions. These things happen with hired staff." "The invitation is quite specific." Mrs. Hooper set the card on the table as though it might burn her fingers. "It names Olivia directly. There's no mention of—" She stopped, but the absence hung in the air like smoke. No mention of Madison, no mention of the diamond who should have been the obvious choice for such an honor. Olivia felt something dangerous bloom in her chest, hope fierce and terrifying. An intimate dinner meant conversation, meant being seen again as something more than wallpaper or useful servant. It meant Elliot had not dismissed their library encounter or their scandalous waltz as aberrations, but rather as beginnings. "How wonderful," Madison said, her smile bright as shattered glass. "Olivia must be thrilled, though I confess I'm concerned. She's been looking rather pale lately, hasn't she, Mother? Almost feverish. I do hope she's not falling ill."
The words were shaped like concern, but Olivia recognized the architecture of threat. She met her sister's gaze and saw calculation there, cold and comprehensive, the look of someone solving a problem through whatever means necessary. "I feel perfectly well," Olivia said quietly. "Do you?" Madison moved closer, her hand reaching out to touch Olivia's forehead with false solicitude. "You feel quite warm to me, and you've barely touched your breakfast all week. Mother, don't you think she looks unwell?" Mrs. Hooper's expression shifted into something Olivia had seen before, but never quite directed at her with such focused intensity, maternal concern weaponized into control. "Now that you mention it, Olivia has seemed rather strained. The season can be overwhelming for those with delicate constitutions." "I'm not delicate," Olivia protested, but her voice sounded weak even to her own ears. "Of course not, darling." Mrs. Hooper rose, moving to stand beside Madison in what appeared to be unconscious alliance. "But we must be practical. If you were to attend the Duke's dinner unwell, you might embarrass yourself. Worse, you might embarrass him. Far better to send regrets now than risk a scene." "I'm not ill," Olivia stood, her embroidery falling to the floor unnoticed. "I'm perfectly capable of attending a dinner." "Are you?" Madison's tone suggested doubt wrapped in sympathy. "You've been so peculiar lately, disappearing into libraries, monopolizing gentlemen's attention, dancing when you should know better. It's almost as though you've been suffering from some kind of nervous condition, a fever of the mind, perhaps." The threat was unsubtle now. Nervous condition, fever of the mind, words that could destroy a woman's reputation more thoroughly than any scandal of impropriety. Ladies who suffered from nervous conditions were locked away for their own protection, hidden from society, rendered invisible not through mere social positioning, but by actual confinement. "That's absurd," Olivia said, but fear had begun its cold crawl up her spine. "Is it?" Mrs. Hooper's voice had taken on the reasonable tone of someone making practical arrangements. "You must admit your behavior has been unusual, Olivia, almost obsessive in your pursuit of the Duke's attention. It's not like you. You've always been so sensible, so content with your role. This sudden ambition, it's concerning." They were rewriting history before her eyes, transforming her moment of visibility into evidence of instability. The library conversation became obsessive pursuit. The waltz became inappropriate ambition. Her desire to attend a dinner she'd been specifically invited to became proof of fever rather than reasonable acceptance of a social obligation. "I won't send regrets," Olivia said, hearing the desperation creeping into her voice. "The Duke invited me. It would be rude to decline without cause."
"But there is cause." Madison's smile was tender, terrible. "You're unwell. You need rest, peace, time away from the pressures of the season to recover your equilibrium." She turned to their mother. "Don't you think, Mother, perhaps a few days confined to her room, just until this fever passes?" Mrs. Hooper nodded slowly, as though the idea had merit, as though imprisoning one daughter to preserve the other's chances was a reasonable maternal decision. Yes, I think that's wise. We'll send word to the Duke that Olivia has fallen ill. Nothing serious, of course, just a temporary indisposition that requires rest and quiet." "No." Olivia backed toward the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. "You can't. I won't." "Darling," Mrs. Hooper's voice was gentle, implacable. "We're doing this for your own good. You're not thinking clearly. The season has overwhelmed you, just as I feared it would. A few days of rest will restore your perspective." Madison rang for the housekeeper, and Mrs. Reynolds appeared with the prompt efficiency of someone who'd been waiting nearby. "Mrs. Reynolds, Miss Olivia is feeling unwell. Please help her to her chamber and ensure she has everything she needs for a period of recuperation. She's not to be disturbed by visitors, and she should take her meals in her room until her health improves." The housekeeper's face remained carefully neutral, but Olivia saw the flicker of understanding there. This was confinement dressed as care, imprisonment disguised as concern. Mrs. Reynolds had served the Hooper household long enough to recognize the dynamics at play. "Please," Olivia said, addressing the housekeeper directly, "I'm not ill. This is—" Now, Madison's hand settled on Olivia's shoulder, gentle as a shackle. "You're clearly distressed. That's the fever talking. Mother and I only want what's best for you, and what's best is rest, away from the pressures that have so obviously overwhelmed your delicate nerves." They guided her from the morning room, their hands solicitous but firm, their voices murmuring reassurances that sounded like directives. Up the stairs, down the corridor, into her small chamber at the back of the house, the room that had always been her refuge, now transformed into her prison. Mrs. Reynolds helped her to the bed, her movements professional but not unkind. As she turned to leave, Olivia caught her sleeve. "Please," she whispered, "send word to the Duke. Tell him—" "Miss Olivia is to have no correspondence," Madison said from the doorway, her voice pleasant as poisoned honey. "Letters might agitate her condition. We must ensure complete rest and quiet until she's recovered her proper perspective." The door closed, the key turned in the lock with a sound like finality, and Olivia sat in her small room, listening to her sister's footsteps retreat down the corridor, realizing that being chosen had made her dangerous, and dangerous things in the Hooper household were contained, controlled, eliminated. Outside her window, Thursday approached with indifferent certainty, carrying with it a dinner she would not attend, and a Duke who would receive only lies about why the woman he'd invited had chosen once again to disappear. The first day of her confinement, Olivia spent cataloguing her resources. The lock on her door was solid, but not impregnable. She'd seen Mrs. Reynolds unlock similar mechanisms throughout the house, using a specific technique involving hairpins and patience. The window overlooked the back garden, a two-storied drop that would break bones but perhaps not kill. The meals arrived 3 times daily, brought by Annie, the upstairs maid, who had worked for the Hoopers for 6 years and whose wages Olivia had personally ensured were paid on time, even when other expenses demanded cutting. The second day she began testing boundaries. She complained of headaches, asked for specific remedies from the apothecary, requested books from the library downstairs. Each request was denied with apologetic firmness. Miss Olivia was to rest completely, no stimulation, no correspondence, nothing that might agitate her delicate condition. But in the pattern of denials, Olivia recognized the architecture of her prison and began identifying its weaknesses. The third day was Wednesday. Thursday, the Duke's dinner, loomed less than 24 hours away. If she was going to act, it would have to be now, before the moment passed and she was dismissed from Elliot's consideration as unreliable or uninterested. Annie brought breakfast at 8, as she always did, her face carefully neutral, but when she set the tray on the small table, Olivia noticed something tucked beneath the napkin, a folded piece of paper, small enough to hide in a palm. After Annie departed and the lock clicked home, Olivia unfolded the note. The handwriting was unfamiliar, awkward, suggesting someone unaccustomed to writing. "Mrs. R. says you're not sick. Kitchen staff agree. We remember you got James his position back after the silver went missing. We remember you convinced Mrs. H. to give Cook's daughter the sewing work. If you need help, miss, we're listening." Olivia read the words 3 times, feeling something loosing in her chest. She'd spent years managing the household staff as numbers in a ledger, ensuring wages were fair and disputes were resolved with justice rather than convenience. She'd never considered that those small acts of competence and fairness might have built something more valuable than efficiency. They'd built loyalty. She tore a page from her journal and wrote carefully, "I need to reach the Duke's dinner tomorrow evening. I'll require assistance leaving the house undetected at 6 o'clock. Will you help me?" When Annie collected the breakfast tray, Olivia made a show of barely touching the food, complaining of continued malaise. As Annie turned to leave, Olivia's let her hand brush the maid's apron, the folded note transferring with practiced subtlety. Annie's expression didn't change, but her fingers closed around the paper with deliberate care.
The afternoon passed with excruciating slowness. Olivia paced her small chamber, running through scenarios and contingencies. Even if the staff helped her escape the house, she still needed appropriate clothing, transportation to Arundel House, and a plausible explanation for why she'd declined the invitation, only to appear anyway. Each problem seemed insurmountable until she remembered the fundamental principle she'd learned managing the household accounts. Complex problems often had simple solutions if you were willing to see past conventional approaches. Evening arrived. Olivia dressed for bed as usual, allowing her mother to check on her in the ritual inspection meant to ensure continued compliance. Mrs. Hooper stood in the doorway, satisfaction evident in her expression. "You look better already," which meant Olivia looked sufficiently defeated. "A few more days of rest, and you'll have forgotten this entire unfortunate incident. The Duke has already received our regrets regarding tomorrow's dinner. Madison will attend in your place. I managed to secure an invitation through Lady Ashworth. It's all working out perfectly." After her mother departed, Olivia waited. 10 o'clock passed. 11. The house settled into nighttime rhythms, floorboards creaking as occupants retired to their chambers. At 11:15, she heard the sound she'd been waiting for, the soft scrape of metal against metal in the lock mechanism. The door opened to reveal Mrs. Reynolds, her expression carved from determination and something that might have been long-suppressed rebellion. Behind her stood Annie, carrying a bundle that proved to be one of Olivia's better gowns, not the grey she usually wore, but a deep blue silk that had been purchased years ago and rarely used. "We've 10 minutes before the next rounds," Mrs. Reynolds said quietly. "There's a servant's entrance through the kitchen that connects to the mews. James has a carriage waiting. His cousin works in the Duke's stable, convenient enough. You'll need to dress quickly." Olivia changed with shaking hands, Annie fastening buttons with efficient speed, while Mrs. Reynolds kept watch at the door. The gown fitted perfectly, elegant without ostentation, appropriate for the intimate dinner she had been explicitly invited to attend.
"Why are you helping me?" Olivia asked, as Annie arranged her hair into something presentable. Mrs. Reynolds met her eyes with steady directness. "Because you're the only one in this household who's ever treated us like people instead of furniture. Because what they're doing to you is wrong, and we all know it. And because if I have to watch Miss Madison treat another scullery maid like dirt, while you take the blame for budget cuts to afford her gowns, I'll lose what's left of my faith in justice." They moved through the house like thieves, using servants' corridors and back staircases that Olivia knew existed but had never actually traversed. The kitchen was empty, the fires banked for the evening. The door to the mews stood open, revealing fog and darkness and the silhouette of James with a modest carriage. "Miss Olivia." James helped her inside, with the deference he'd always shown, though his voice held warmth that suggested he understood this was rebellion rather than routine. "Duke's house in Mayfair, then. His cousin says there's a dinner tomorrow evening. Very particular guest list." "Tomorrow evening, yes. But James, I need to arrive tonight. I need to speak with the Duke before the dinner, before he hears whatever lies my family has told him about my absence." James nodded as though midnight visits to ducal residences were perfectly reasonable. "Right then, best get moving. Fog's thick enough to hide an army tonight, which serves our purposes nicely." The carriage lurched into motion, carrying Olivia away from her prison and toward a confrontation that would either vindicate her escape or confirm every terrible thing her family believed about her judgment. She pressed her face to the window, watching the townhouse recede into fog, and thought about Eliot's words in the library. Some observers prefer subtlety to spectacle. She'd spent her entire life being subtle, being invisible, being useful in ways that required her own erasure. Tonight she would be spectacle. She would arrive at the Duke's house unannounced, uninvited at this hour, and demand to be heard. It was improper, scandalous, precisely the kind of behavior that confirmed nervous conditions and justified confinement. It was also the only way forward that didn't require her to disappear.
The carriage rolled through fog-choked streets toward Mayfair, toward Arundel House, toward a duke who valued drainage systems over dance steps and honesty over performance, toward the terrifying possibility that being seen might be worth the cost of visibility. Behind her, the Hooper household slept, unaware that their carefully constructed hierarchy had just sustained a crack that no amount of maternal concern or sisterly conspiracy could repair. The useful daughter had become ungovernable. The second sister had claimed first place, and tomorrow evening's dinner would proceed exactly as planned, though not quite as anyone had anticipated. The morning after Olivia's midnight escape arrived with fog thick enough to obscure the street beyond the Hooper townhouse windows. Mrs. Hooper discovered her daughter's absence at precisely 7 o'clock when she arrived for the daily inspection of the invalid, only to find an empty room, an unlocked door, and a folded note on the pillow that read simply, "I've gone to accept an invitation I was prevented from declining properly." The household erupted into controlled chaos. Mrs. Reynolds was interrogated about the lock. Annie claimed ignorance with wide, innocent eyes. James had mysteriously taken the evening off to visit his ailing mother, a mother who'd been dead for 3 years, though no one thought to verify this detail in the moment. Madison, summoned from her chamber still in her dressing gown, listened to the frantic recounting with an expression that shifted from shock to calculation to cold fury. "She's gone to him," Madison said flatly, "to the Duke. She's probably spinning some pathetic tale about being mistreated, making us look like villains while she plays the martyred victim." "We must send word immediately." Mrs. Hooper wrung her hands, her careful composure fracturing. "Explain that Olivia is confused, perhaps suffering from delusions brought on by her condition. We can control this if we act quickly." But they were already too late. At 10:30, a knock sounded at the door with the particular authority that suggested it would not be ignored. When the butler opened it, he found not a messenger, but the Duke of Arundel himself, flanked by his secretary and looking like judgment personified in mourning dress. Mrs. Hooper rushed to the entrance hall, her face arranged into delighted surprise that didn't quite mask the panic in her eyes. "Your Grace, what an unexpected honor! Please do come in. I'm afraid the house is in some disarray. We've had rather a difficult morning." "I'm aware." Elliot stepped inside without waiting for proper invitation, his grey eyes sweeping the space with the assessing gaze of someone cataloguing evidence. "I'm here to speak with Miss Olivia Hooper. I trust she's available, despite the letter I received yesterday claiming she was too ill to attend my dinner." The words were shaped like a question, but delivered like an accusation. Mrs. Hooper's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, her mind clearly racing through possible responses. Before she could formulate one, Madison appeared on the stairs, perfectly coiffed despite the early hour, her morning gown a delicate rose that suggested innocence and feminine fragility. "Your Grace, how kind of you to call." Her voice was honey and concern. "I'm afraid there's been a terrible misunderstanding. My sister has been quite unwell. Nervous exhaustion, the physician said. She's been confined to her room for her own protection, but this morning we discovered she'd somehow managed to leave during the night. We're frantic with worry." "Are you?" Elliot's tone was flat, unconvinced. How remarkably convenient that this nervous exhaustion manifested precisely when she received an invitation from me, and that her confinement prevented her from attending. "The timing is unfortunate, certainly, but surely you understand that family must sometimes make difficult decisions for a daughter's welfare. Olivia has been behaving so strangely lately, pursuing attentions beyond her station, forgetting her place. We feared she might embarrass herself, or worse, embarrass you." "Beyond her station." Elliot repeated the phrase as though examining it for flaws. "I wasn't aware that accepting a dinner invitation from a gentleman who'd specifically requested her presence constituted overreach. Perhaps you could clarify exactly what Miss Olivia's proper station is meant to be." Madison descended the remaining stairs with deliberate grace. "Your Grace, I think you misunderstand the dynamics of our family. Olivia is dear to us, but she's always been rather delicate, prone to fantasies. She's convinced herself that you harbor some special interest in her, when clearly," she gestured to herself with false modesty, "well, I'm sure you understand where any gentleman's true attentions would naturally lie." "Do I?" Something dangerous flickered in Elliot's expression. "Perhaps you should enlighten me about where my attentions naturally lie, since apparently you understand my mind better than I do myself." The sarcasm was sharp enough to draw blood, but Madison pressed forward with the confidence of someone who'd never truly been denied. "I simply mean that Olivia has always been the practical sister, the one who manages household matters and stays in the background. It's her role, her purpose. When you showed her kindness, engaging her in conversation, asking her to dance, she mistook politeness for genuine interest. We tried to gently disabuse her of these notions, but she became quite insistent, quite obsessive." "Obsessive," Elliot's voice had gone cold as winter steel. "You locked your sister in her room, forged her handwriting to decline my invitation, and now you're attempting to characterize her as mentally unsound to justify your actions. Is that an accurate summary?" The blunt statement landed like a physical blow. Mrs. Hooper went pale. Madison's perfect composure cracked, revealing raw fury beneath. "We did what was necessary," she hissed. "She was threatening everything. You were supposed to notice me, to pursue me. I'm the diamond, the one who deserves—" "Miss Madison," Elliot's interruption was surgical in its precision. "I'm going to say this once, and I suggest you listen carefully. I noticed you at my ball. Every gentleman there noticed you. You made certain of it. But noticing someone and finding them interesting are entirely different things. Your sister engaged my mind. You simply occupied space very loudly."
Madison recoiled as though slapped. "How dare you?" "I dare because I'm a duke with sufficient power to ensure the truth of this situation becomes widely known, should I choose to make it so." Elliot's tone was conversational, but the threat was unmistakable. "Now, I'm going to ask one more time, and I require an honest answer. Where is Miss Olivia, and what exactly did you do to prevent her from attending my dinner?" "She's not here," Mrs. Hooper whispered. "She escaped during the night. We don't know where." "I do." Elliot moved toward the door, then paused. "Miss Olivia spent last evening and this morning as a guest in my home, under the chaperonage of my aunt, Lady Margrave. She told me everything: the locked door, the forged note, the systematic erasure of her personhood to preserve your daughter's supposed supremacy. She also told me she was afraid to come back here, afraid you'd find some way to confine her more permanently." He turned back to face them, and his expression held contempt, so absolute it transformed his features into something aristocratic and merciless. "So here is my ultimatum. Miss Olivia will attend my dinner this evening as planned. She will do so without interference, harassment, or any further attempts at sabotage. Should anything prevent her attendance, should she meet with any accident, fall mysteriously ill again, or simply disappear, I will ensure that every drawing-room in London knows precisely what occurred in this house. I will make certain that the Hooper name becomes synonymous with cruelty, deception, and the imprisonment of inconvenient daughters. Do we understand each other?" The silence that followed was absolute. Even the servants who'd been hovering at the edges of the hall seemed to have stopped breathing. Mrs. Hooper managed a single nod, her face ashen. Madison stood frozen on the stairs, her beauty rendered irrelevant by the defeat written across her features. "Excellent." Elliot adjusted his gloves with deliberate care. "Miss Olivia will be collecting her belongings this afternoon, accompanied by Lady Margrave's companion. I trust you'll offer no resistance to her removing her personal effects from this house. After tonight, she'll be residing with my aunt until more permanent arrangements can be made. Good day." He departed, leaving devastation in his wake.
And somewhere in Mayfair, Olivia prepared for a dinner that would mark not just a social triumph, but her complete liberation from the hierarchy that had defined her entire existence. The Duke's intimate dinner proved to be anything but intimate in its consequences. 12 guests, carefully selected, represented the most influential voices in London society, the matrons who shaped opinion, the gentlemen whose approval mattered, the arbiters of reputation who could elevate or destroy with a single whispered comment. Olivia understood immediately that Elliot had transformed what should have been a simple dinner into a public declaration, a gauntlet thrown at the feet of every assumption about worth and value that governed their world. She wore the deep blue silk, altered slightly by Lady Margrave's seamstress to fit perfectly, and her hair was dressed simply but elegantly by a maid who worked with competence rather than artistry. When she descended the stairs of Arundel House to join the assembled guests, the conversation didn't stop, which was somehow more powerful than if it had. They simply absorbed her presence, these powerful people, and adjusted their understanding of the evening accordingly. Elliot met her at the entrance to the dining room, offering his arm with deliberate formality. "Miss Hooper, you look well rested. I trust Lady Margrave's hospitality has been adequate." "More than adequate, Your Grace. She's been extraordinarily kind." The words were proper, conventional, but underneath ran a current of shared understanding. They were performing for an audience, establishing a narrative that would spread through London like fire through dry timber. He seated her to his right hand, the position traditionally reserved for the guest of highest honour. Across the table, Lady Pemberton raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Lord Ashworth looked between Olivia and the empty seat where convention suggested Madison should have been, and his expression suggested he was already composing the story he'd tell at his club. The dinner proceeded with surprising ease. Olivia found herself drawn into conversation about estate management, about the challenges of balancing tenant welfare with profitability, about agricultural innovation and infrastructure investment. The gentlemen engaged her directly, their questions genuine rather than condescending. The ladies watched with varying degrees of curiosity and calculation, reassessing their assumptions about the quiet Hooper sister who'd always seemed so forgettable. It was Lady Margrave, Elliot's formidable aunt, who finally addressed the obvious absence. "I understand your sister was also invited this evening, Miss Hooper. I hope she's not unwell." The question hung in the air, deliberate as a chess move. Olivia met the older woman's eyes and saw encouragement there, permission to speak truth in a world that typically demanded comfortable lies. "My sister is perfectly well, Lady Margrave. She was unable to attend due to a misunderstanding about which Miss Hooper the invitation was intended for." Olivia kept her voice steady, conversational. "My family assumed the Duke's interest would naturally gravitate toward the more conventionally celebrated daughter. They were mistaken." The silence that followed lasted only seconds, but within it Olivia could feel the shift occurring, the recalibration of perception, the adjustment of social mathematics. She'd admitted the truth without apology, without shame, simply stating facts that anyone with eyes could have observed. "How remarkably honest," Lady Pemberton said, and something in her tone suggested approval rather than censure. "One grows tired of the endless performance, the careful pretense that every match is a romance rather than a negotiation. Your candor is refreshing, Miss Hooper." "My sister possesses many qualities," Elliot said, his voice carrying across the table with deliberate clarity. "But I confess I find her intelligence and practical competence more compelling than beauty that exists primarily to be admired. A duchess, after all, must manage considerably more than her appearance." Duchess. The word fell into conversation like a stone into still water, ripples expanding outward. Several guests exchanged glances. Lady Margrave smiled into her wine-glass, and Olivia felt her heart perform acrobatics that had nothing to do with social triumph and everything to do with the man sitting beside her, who just declared his intentions before witnesses who would ensure all of London knew by morning. The evening concluded near midnight. Guests departed with promises to call, with invitations extended, with the subtle indicators that Olivia had been accepted into circles previously closed to her. As the last carriage rolled away, Elliot turned to her in the entrance hall, his expression softening from ducal formality into something more genuine. "There's one more matter that requires attention. Your family will be hosting a gathering tomorrow evening. Your mother sent word this afternoon, a desperate attempt to reassert Madison's position. I think you should attend." Olivia's stomach clenched. "I'm not certain that's wise." "It's necessary." Elliot's hand found hers, his fingers warm and steady. "You need to face them one final time, not as the useful sister or the permanent second, but as yourself, as the woman who escaped, who spoke truth, who claimed her own value. Otherwise, some part of you will always wonder if you are running away rather than moving forward." He was right, which made the prospect no less terrifying. But Olivia had spent her life avoiding confrontation, smoothing conflict, making herself small to accommodate others' needs. If she was going to step fully into this new existence, Duchess or not, chosen or not, she needed to do it without shadows.
The next evening arrived with the inexorable certainty of tide. The Hooper townhouse blazed with candles, filled with guests who'd come partly for entertainment and partly to witness the rumored conflict between the sisters. Madison held court in the drawing-room, resplendent in emerald silk that matched her initial triumph, her smile bright and brittle as glass. Olivia arrived on Elliot's arm, dressed not in grey but in deep sapphire that caught the light and refused to apologize. The conversation didn't precisely stop when they entered, but it quieted, shifted, became attentive in the way that predators become attentive when they sense interesting prey. Madison saw them immediately. Her face cycled through shock, fury, and desperate calculation before settling on gracious hostess performing magnanimity. "Sister, how lovely that you could join us. And your Grace, what an unexpected honor." "Miss Madison," Elliot's tone was perfectly polite and utterly dismissive. "Thank you for receiving us." They moved through the room, and Olivia felt the difference immediately. People met her eyes now, engaged her in conversation, treated her as someone worth knowing rather than someone to be politely ignored. The hierarchy had shifted, realigned around new mathematics that valued substance over sparkle. Madison intercepted them near the refreshment table, her smile a weapon barely sheathed. "Olivia, might I have a word, privately?" Elliot glanced at Olivia, a question in his eyes. She nodded slightly, and he released her arm with visible reluctance. "I'll be nearby," he said quietly, a promise and a threat directed at Madison. The sisters moved to a small alcove, partially hidden from the main room, but not entirely private. Madison's mask dropped the moment they were relatively alone, revealing the raw fury beneath. "You've won. Congratulations. You've manipulated a duke into believing you're something more than a glorified housekeeper. How long do you think that will last once he realizes you have nothing to offer but competence, once the novelty of your supposed intelligence wears thin?" Olivia met her sister's eyes and felt, for the first time in her life, no fear of what she saw there. "I didn't manipulate anyone. I simply stopped pretending to be less than I am to make you comfortable, and he noticed because he was looking for substance, not performance." "Substance?" Madison's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "You're still nothing. You'll always be nothing. A duchess's title won't change what you fundamentally are. Second, forever second." "You're wrong,"
Olivia's voice was quiet but absolute. "I was second because I believed the story you told me about my own worth. But you made a mistake, Madison. You taught me that being useful meant being invisible, but you never considered that visibility might be a choice rather than an accident. I choose to be seen now, and the remarkable thing is, once I made that choice, I discovered I'd been first at something all along. First in kindness, first in competence, first in the qualities that actually matter when you're building a life rather than performing one." She turned to leave, then paused. "I don't hate you. I pity you, because you'll spend your life chasing attention that evaporates the moment you stop performing, while I'll be building something real with someone who values truth over theater. Enjoy your emerald, sister. I'll take substance instead." Olivia walked away, back toward Elliot, who waited with steady patience, back toward a life that didn't require her to diminish herself to accommodate someone else's need for supremacy. Behind her, Madison stood frozen in her alcove, her beauty intact but her power finally irrevocably broken. Elliot offered his arm. Ready to leave? Yes, Olivia placed her hand in his, feeling the rightness of it, the certainty. "I'm ready." They departed together, and every eye in the room tracked their exit, the Duke and the woman who'd been invisible, now impossible to ignore. First in London, not through performance or manipulation, but through the simple revolutionary act of claiming her own worth. Outside, fog pressed close as always, but Olivia walked through it without fear, knowing that some observers had always preferred subtlety to spectacle, and she, finally, had learned to prefer herself. Dear listeners, thank you so much for joining us on Olivia and Elliot's journey from invisibility to recognition, from erasure to empowerment. If this story of courage, defiance, and claiming one's own worth resonated with you, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe so you never miss a story. Please leave a comment sharing your thoughts. We love hearing from you, and your insights always add richness to these narratives. Give us a like if you enjoyed watching Olivia step out of the shadows and claim her place as first in London. And don't forget to turn on notifications so you'll be the first to know when we share our next tale of hearts finding their way home. Your support means everything to us, and we're so honored you chose to spend this time with us. Until next time, may you always have the courage to be seen for who you truly are, and may you find someone who values substance over spectacle.